I'm Tom Dennis, CEO of Serenity in Leadership, and we're premier leadership development and culture integration specialists. We help businesses overcome challenges and achieve successful, lasting outcomes whilst always putting their people at the heart of the business. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Helen Argyrou in our series, Exploring Leading Responsibly in a VUCA World with Integrity and Purpose. So, Helen, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to this. Tom, I'm very excited to share this time with you.
Brilliant. Fantastic. It's wonderful to have you on this podcast. Can you give us just a very quick sort of overview of your work and where you've come from and you know what's really important to you today?
Yes, thank you so much, Tom, for inviting me to this. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I studied clinical psychology. I've always been a more creative mind, but have a very strong analytical way of understanding the world. So I went further into studying the way rhythm affects the brain. I became a musician and a drummer, so I was fascinated by new healing modalities, new ways to bring the body-mind system into integration through the central nervous system. Learned a lot about how that all works, and then went into leadership training and mentoring startups and business innovation. Fascinating because it's very creative. And I've done a lot of work on gender and how to build more visibility, higher destiny, optimize performance. And that's mainly the work I do now.
Fantastic. Thank you. So let's dive into this. You work or trained as a clinical psychologist. How does your background in crisis counseling inform your approach to leadership coaching?
Well, it's a very brilliant question for the times we're living in, Tom. I think this is really a very interesting time in history. Some people have actually talked about it as the frothy edge of evolution, Ken Wilber. And another great woman, Dr. Jean Houston, calls this an epic time. And I think what makes it so epic is that we are facing very specific challenges, and they are critical challenges for us to either overcome and or regenerate brand new solutions for the world from. So I think crisis is a very important opportunity for us to have to meet an edge in ourselves that is a edge that we cannot cross unless we discover something in ourselves from the void, or unless we develop a whole new skill in being then able to meet the crisis, get through it, and actually reinvent ourselves. And so for me, crisis counseling was one of the most amazing opportunities I had to meet people in very dire situations. And I was privileged to hear them in the void, to hear their struggle at that time in the void. And I've been in my own challenging times, as I'm sure all of us have. So we all know what it's like to be facing an edge that we cannot cross, part of ourselves that we haven't known how to use in whatever we are facing. And I think humanity is at that place now. And we need lots of reassurance, but more than that, we need guidance and leadership from people that actually have crossed a juncture in their own inner process, people that have been through some kind of dark night of the soul, or people that have regenerated in this way that I've been talking about.
The dark night of the soul, yes. With your experience, can you just paint a little picture of give an example of that?
Right.
I'm hearing the words, but I want to feel the picture.
Yeah, what does it look like?
Yeah.
Well, if we see the way we are in the world now, we have so many very interesting shadows coming into light. And by example of our leaders out there, even people that are self-led, you know, all of us in our own lives are starting to see certain things that we've kept buried for a very long time. And I think that's not just coincidental. It's very typical of the time we're in. So we have, according to some ancient Greek philosophers, this idea that the planet goes through contraction and expansion in different, almost 300-year intervals. And so we tend to look at this time, some of us, as a time of contraction. And in times of contraction, we've just come out of great expansion, used up a whole lot of resources, people leading companies, people leading projects, governments, even us in our own lives, had a certain kind of mask that we would wear in order to manage all this. And it was quite difficult to really get real about the shadows, about the parts of us we don't like, the parts of us that don't look good out there in society, getting real about certain things that maybe show our weaknesses or show our vulnerability. But we've seen the rise of emotional intelligence. We've seen lots of kickback against racial prejudice, bias. We've seen lots of these leaders out there kind of revealed for things that they've done in the past or might even be doing right there in their leadership position that are not the kinds of things we accept or endorse watching them as our leaders. So I think when we talk about crossing an edge or looking at that in practical terms, how does crisis intervention or crisis kind of understanding crisis really apply to this time, is that when we do have to see parts of ourselves, when others out us on things that we've done that maybe we've been hiding away or lying about, or simply we're not kind of professional enough in, and or when it gets exposed in whatever way, when we get taken down, let's say, yes, it could be slightly corruptive for us, and maybe it's not done in good intention, but if it's the truth and it's really there, it can be very hard to integrate that. And that's what I mean by bringing the shadow into the light. So right now we're in a time, I think, where we do have to, as humanity and as individuals and as leaders specifically too, really look at what we are about and come to terms with the parts of us maybe we don't accept, or the parts of us we don't like, or the parts of us that don't make us look good. There've been some excellent examples, like the lady in Finland. I forget if she's a president or a prime minister. I think she's a prime minister.
Prime Minister, Sanna Marin.
Had her life, exactly, had her social life out there. And she handled it in a way that people are really beginning to kind of restructure and rearrange in terms of how we agreeably integrate the shadow of who we are in leadership positions. So I think when we talk about the times we're in, it's an incredible opportunity for us to have to learn about the way to be more integrative as human beings, and for our leaders to also be more integrative, and yes, to have to uphold certain virtues and values at a certain point in their leadership, and to be real about that, to be honest about it, to not be hiding things in the shadows, to actually be integrating it. And of course, if there's certain things that are not appropriate, then yeah, they should not be in leadership positions. And that's a very hard line to draw, because we haven't had the courage as a race, as a species, to really uphold that throughout history. And we've all suffered, and we still do. Our egos are constructed this way to want power and to not give up power when someone decides or it comes to light that maybe we don't deserve it. It takes a lot of maturity. And so I love that quote. I forget who said it, but the person who wants power the least is the best to hold it. So, those kinds of studied leaders that have been into depths and have come to terms with their own fallibility and can stand still strong and then guide, I think are the people we really need to be listening to now. And those kinds of people are humble, totally in nature, but they have the virtue and the integration of ego with essence, really kind of standing in true power to be able to truly lead. And I think this is where we are now. We're trying to see, how do we recalibrate leadership in the world, and how can we be more real and integrative?
These are big things, aren't they?
Yeah.
Particularly when in times of uncertainty, the natural instinct is to turn to someone and say, please take this pain away from me, please lead me, please help me, and that sort of leads to the populist environment that we find ourselves in, where people just love the message and will be incredibly loyal to that, even if it actually leads them into more pain.
Yeah, it's so interesting you reference that, because it also reminds me of how we're in a time where there's new versions of what leading really is. Like, we have influencers now. Andy Warhol said everyone's going to be famous for at least 1 minute in the future. And I mean, here it is, it's true. You watch a video, it could be 6 million people watching it on something that maybe years ago would only be taught or shown in a very particular position, whereas now we have this free access. So we're all called into that visibility, to have to be more visible in all of who we are. And so, does it help us be more responsible or not? We don't know.
How do you see exploring the dichotomy of science and spirituality helpful in building solutions for tomorrow's challenges? Is it a dichotomy?
Beautiful question. I think we just went there a little bit, didn't we? We sort of talked about the critical time we're in, and that change as well as conflict can bring us into such a deep contemplation with ourselves at a deeper level. And I think that is what I understand from spiritual, and that everything is spiritual depending on your perception as well of it. Of course, it depends what you think spirituality is, what anyone listening thinks spirituality is. But I don't see the dichotomy in certain instances as much as I do in others. And I think that in itself is such an interesting reflection of how we haven't been able to integrate things in life that go beyond our ego's desire, because that's probably the simplest version of spirituality for me, is to feel things, to want things, to serve things, to offer yourself to things that are not just for your own self-interest. And that builds some kind of spiritual value, or what spirituality is trying to teach us, I guess, is how to be considerate, how to have a certain moral tone, not because things are really right or wrong, just because certain things serve the universal law of nature and the way things evolve, and other things could corrupt that or destroy that. But it's all part of this universe, so it's all accepted. It's all part of our growth, I guess. But really, the distinctions that we've made in the world about what is scientific, what is spiritual, have started to merge in the most beautiful way now. We have some amazing research that's proving, all the way from Dr. Deepak Chopra's work, who's a very spiritually focused medical practitioner, bringing this kind of laws of physics into success, business, healthy living, all the way to very new research on things that have been taught in yoga since the beginning of time.
Yes.
So we have amazing research on energy, how it moves up the spine, what happens in the brain when we visualize, when we meditate, and what's actually going on when we think into a sense of gratefulness and appreciation. And you run Serenity Leadership, so you know exactly what I mean, Thom. So that serenity and that peacefulness, I think we're all trying to find through our spirituality, but sometimes get distracted with a million other things we think we're looking for. But I think it's that internal peace. I mean, that in itself, serenity itself, I think is something we could call spiritual in some way. So I would answer it yes and no. The dichotomy exists because our consciousness can't grasp it, maybe. But does it really exist in truth? No. I had an amazing supervisor once who told me about this whole discussion between the mind and body. And I was having a very interesting inquiry about the body. Why do we talk about the body, and why do we talk about the mind? And he said to me, well, you are your body. And in that statement, it just landed for me that the way we keep separating things is part of our problem, is that we are one thing. We are this whole reality. So yeah, let's stop there before it gets too philosophical.
No, but I agree with you. So your work also looks at well, the body mind. We've talked about that. But how has your research into neuroscience impacted how you see the relationship
between science and spirituality?
Well, the body mind.
Right, between the body and the mind. Well, what my example that I just led into now, maybe for all of us, certainly around my age group, maybe a little bit older, we've grown up with the inclusion of technology interspersed through our growth. And now we've come into a time where technology is fully in our lives and fully operational, and it's become a new language. And what it's given us is an ability to really research real-time cognition, which we never had in the beginning of my training as a psychologist. So I was actually told when I wanted to study how rhythm affects the brain to wait until the technology evolves, because at that time you couldn't study, just as an example, how, and it's a great example for this question, how the mind is responding to the body in real time. So you couldn't see how, let's say somebody gives you a gift and you want to see how that affects the cognition in the brain. There was only MRIs way back when. Now that we can actually see real-time MRI and we can have certain interference into the MRI imaging in neuroscience, we can actually extract different pieces of that data to see what is the actual effect of feeling when you open up this present. There's been some amazing sci-fi videos on all this stuff too. What happens in virtual reality, what's going on in children's brains when they play so many games. So before you just couldn't do that because the motion would affect the imaging. So you wouldn't be able to have realistic results. Now you can. And so to my point is that in so doing, it's come to light that all that we've been studying until now is very separatist again. It's been very dualistic, very separatist thinking. Like we say, well, the brain is doing this, but now we know the brain is actually connected to the heart and they communicate together. And we call that coherence. And there's all this new heart math research that people, I think, have simplified, but it's very complex and a very significant discovery in our time. This true integrative component between brain and heart, and how they cannot work separately, they work together. And the magic of that relationship creates again the magic of each organ being so magnificent for what it does. It could simply never exist separately. And the same now for the lungs and the breath. So the fact that the body breathes and the heart pulsates and the brain creates connections through this whole central nervous system is a very, very profound system of synergistic operations going on all at once. So for me, it's been fascinating to discover that, because it's actually helped me to, I guess, deepen my practice of psychology and respect even more my approach to spirituality, and to insist on having them integrate, even though in my profession there's certain confusion about how they do. And of course, one has to be very mindful of who you work with and how you work and how people understand information. So we have like a responsibility, I guess, to begin to find ways to understand these things in unison as opposed to separating off. There's been a lot of problems in medicine. It's one of my big passions to elevate health thought leaders who work on the integrative spectrum, a little bit beyond what is called holistic, but to work more at putting the pieces to work together of how people get sick and how they get better. And although we know it and we've heard it, it's really not practiced, and it's not respected enough in moments where it absolutely counts, and it's critical that it should matter. So when people, have a chronic illness, they need to be met with an emotional tone and a level of spiritual inquiry in their recovery process. But we don't have that in the protocol of how we work with people in the medical industry even. And that's very disconcerting for me. So it's been a very important part of my work and my career is to understand that and to bring new ways of explaining why this is so important, from looking at ancient knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and seeing how does it match up with the science? How do we put all this together? Where can we display this information so people listen more? How can we insist that people in leadership positions in health and wellness be more considerate of how to integrate things? Because we do a lot of damage by just treating the liver, for example, for a disease and not looking at what is the, for example, emotional component to what led to that particular disease.
I find all this subject completely riveting, and it's very exciting how we're finally beginning to integrate. We're just acknowledging that there's whatever it is, 5,000 years of wisdom that modern science has just discarded because it doesn't fit into certain paradigms. It always strikes me, though, that when I lived in the States, it was very interesting because if I needed a physical assessment,
right,
I could go to a place that's supported by the insurance company, and they would pay for it. Whereas here in the UK, they won't pay for anything unless you get sick.
well, so no prevention, no like making sure you don't need the system at some point so heavily. Lots of problems. Yeah, I know in Holland, when I lived there for a while, there was a big crisis in the healthcare system, and they were talking about the whole system in Europe going to collapse at some point. This was even pre-COVID. Imagine now, post-COVID, where things really stand. And the whole point of even having to go and get your medical documents x-rayed in a separate place and have that information in a separate place versus, the doctor who treats you, all that kind of separatist thinking again, not having everything in one place. Doctor knows many other things that have happened to you. I mean, we're trying, but we haven't really gotten far enough with any of this. So it's good that we're in a time when we're starting to realize it.
Yes,
yeah.
And of course the same applies within organizations. That's what we do, is really try and look at what's happening at a systemic level, because almost always when you are asked to deal with a presenting problem, that's never the problem.
Exactly.
It's something else. It's something deeper.
Yeah.
And that's the bit to chase. Otherwise, you're forever solving a problem and creating new problems in the way that you solve it, which of course
exactly
helps consultancies with their income, but actually doesn't help the clients. So
yeah.
Your retreats and workshops focus on women and truth.
Yes.
What lies do you think women believe, and how does this impact their careers?
Yeah, I'm laughing because this word truth is so interesting to unpack. I think I've become so passionate about this topic and now so spent getting to the bottom of it. When you try and get to the bottom of a barrel type idea, digging or looking for water underground. I tend to go into those spaces a little. I like to search for things. And I've discovered some very interesting, obvious facts. And I think the fact that they're so obvious is part of what is fascinating for me, because there are really specific barriers to all of us developing into our fullest potential. And we've recently seen a lot of study in that. We've also, I think, all gotten a little bit nauseous from the amount of feminism and post-feminism and gender equity and female representation topics and debates that are out there right now. We are in full throttle, dissecting, analyzing, promoting, insisting about fixing certain things in the world that we think are not right. But the fact that they remain stuck in some ways is part of why I decided to discover some of the deeper layers in it. And I can definitely say that for me, I needed to prove the research first, obviously, because it's not just my opinion that matters. It needs to be founded in some kind of evidence. And this is where things became very interesting, because the obvious things I discovered were still not being dealt with. And this is what I think is the most fascinating thing about truth, is that we all know different things about ourselves that are the truth, but we don't have something in us that helps us manage to integrate it, or we don't. Is it courage? Is it the social political environment that tells us we need to hide that away? And this is what I was beginning to become much more focused on. So when I discovered the lies, they have a lot to do with self-esteem and self-worth, that women do question their self-worth at a very deep level. And the bigger inquiry then is why, and what are the building blocks that have to be amended for that to stop, or to at least slow down. And why are we so deadlocked in this debate, in this discussion? And again, it's so obvious. We all know there's been a system where, men have been more active in certain circles, and women in some way kind of endorsed that, but also women had another very significant job to do, which kept them a bit away from being that active in those spaces, which is child rearing. We didn't have contraception until very recently. We don't have a lot of very experienced businesswomen in the world. Most of them are amateur at best when you look at the length of time they've been experimenting with business compared to what men have been experimenting on and in for the time that they've been there. So the lies are really around self-esteem, not feeling good enough. The other lies, like feeling like you have to be like a man in order to succeed. And there's a great paradox in that one. It's kind of a dichotomy in a way, but it's a healthy paradox, because it's part of what gets us to engage with what is deadlocked and unlock from that. And there's another lie that also we don't matter as much in these spaces, that we matter in other places. And then you see women over-identifying with the role of being a mother, or, being the one who's in charge of the kitchen, or the one who's going to, be micromanaging the cleanliness of the house, because in that way, that's where she's allowed to have her power and leadership. Certainly in very traditional societies, like here in Cyprus, where I live, there's very specific, you could say, adjustments women make in order to feel their power. But in these spaces, they do feel like they don't matter that much. And then they look out there and they'll see, well, there aren't that many women. The story's changing, but I think there's a lot of things that we still need to do. And one of the main remedies that I talk about in this book I'm now publishing on all these results is how we need to get back in touch with our spiritual legacy as women. This is one of the things we have to do. We've been cut from our magic. So how do we do that? Many different ways. But it's really having to retrieve all this ancient knowledge from the women in antiquity that were leaders, the matriarchal communities, the divine feminine essence, and really begin to embody that and make sense of it in this time that we're living in. And I know you're such a great supporter, Thom, of the whole feminine kind of curve into business. So it's always great to talk about these subjects with you, because it's nothing but deeply confirming to hear more and more men support that and see that and contribute towards it, like you do too.
Thank you. It does feel incredibly important to me for whatever reason. I was listening to the radio yesterday. There was an interview with a young woman in Pakistan who is doing whatever she can to help women who are all the normal facilities that women have for their menstrual cycle have sort of been stopped. And so there's awful lot of women who are in distress just as a result of that, quite apart from anything else. And she was reflecting on how her family have disowned her because she's dealing with this issue. She's raising money and all that kind of thing. And what do you think are the roots of the unwillingness? I mean, unwilling is probably a very weak word there, of people to allow what I call a healthy conversation around this whole subject. Where does it come from? What are the roots of this distaste, or I mean, it's taboo, isn't it? Where does it come from?
Do you mean specifically men's approach towards menstruation, or do you mean generally women trying to solve women-related issues and how the world supports that?
Well, I had in my mind men's issues with menstruation and their unwillingness to talk about it. And indeed, I mean, you know, I've had conversations with some very powerful women in large organizations who, as you've described already, tend to behave like men, and their unwillingness to discuss this, and the whole sort of it's such a closed subject, and yet it's such a natural part of our beingness, humanness. No, beingness.
Now we're swimming in these beautiful waters of like transparency with the truth, because here is where it's really cracking open, where we see our inability to integrate the shadow. And the distaste, I think, is coming back to this feeling of shame. And the shame in itself is very, very complex, because it has within it a certain amount of absolute bias and prejudice towards strength as opposed to vulnerability. And if we start to unpack that even more, we see the low emotional intelligence. So to be able to feel emotions and work through them and become new and guide oneself out so that you know what to do from that feeling, because feelings always have a message. And only when we kind of get too stuck on them, and even then there's a reason for that. There's something we're being shown because we get so stuck or get so sad or get so lonely, you know, there's something we're needing that we can't offer. So when there's so much shame that we can't deal with something that is a natural part of life, we have to begin asking those questions. Is why am I so attached to that shame? And I think it has many different reasons. One is just what we said, an inability to process emotion and to deal with vulnerability, second one. And I think thirdly, there really is a certain piece of magic inside the menstrual cycle that we've always had and we've always known about. And women have actually done ritual and ceremony and all kinds of practices, which many of us are aware of in ancient times, but we consider that paganistic or kind of wrong or primal or tribal. But in fact, it is primordial. And there's something in our society that wants to go away from what is primal or primordial and wants to be more progressive. And we equate a progressive approach with being far away from nature. So it's not uncommon that you would see people that are trying to move into more modernized type societies try to hide shame or silence or make secret or bury these parts of us that are more connected to the primordial realm, or the parts of us that in this case are primordial and carry a bit of magic. Plus, there's a lot of mystery around the true power and nature of women when they are in harmony and synchronization with the menstrual cycle and the kind of intuitive, embodied wisdom and power they bring to the world. And after delving really deep into these topics, I have come to the conclusion that there is a lot of fear of that in men and in women. It's different, but it's very unconscious and it's passed on generation to generation. And in fact, there's so much fear of it that it's actually been, and we see this in different pathology and psychology, which is fascinating to talk more about. I don't know if we have, that kind of time, but we tend to go into really weird extractions when we are really sick in something. And you see this in kind of pathological behavior or if we can say, a bit more technical term of like sexual paraphilias, what we call distortions of sexual energy, happen when there isn't a primal need being met in love and intimacy in certain people. That maybe, even fetishes are very interesting to notice, because somebody might develop a fetish because they, again, haven't been able to have enough of this thing, or they've got a lot of ideas that start to build up about this particular part of a woman's body, or this particular part of life as we see it. It can happen with wealth, with food, with sex, with drugs, with whatever. We fixate on things when we're not meeting the deeper need. And so I think the deeper need is to truly venerate, respect, and adore women and their magic. But somewhere religion, social, political structure, the whole complexity of what birth and having children actually does to men and their sense of responsibility, we have to respect that that's a very challenging thing for men, to be confronted with a pregnancy and to have to parent when it's not something they embody, but it's something they give to, and sometimes unconsciously, sometimes they didn't want to, sometimes they wish it just wasn't there. We would all love to not, have to reap the consequences of our actions at different points. So all this together, I think in those moments, there is this absolute distrust and distaste for certain things that are going to call up in us all this awkward, inept, self-judgment, judgment of others, which really is always just a reflection of our own inability to deal with the shadow again. So how do I, and really it shouldn't be the shadow, but the magic in it is the shadow. The awkwardness of it is the shadow. And why women have been in charge of that part of society is, again, a fascinating point, which is why I say maybe we don't have the time to go so deep into that. But it is true in many texts that deal with the feminine essence at the tantric level, and in deep teachings, they talk about how women are in charge of pulling the hair out of the drain when they're cleaning. And women have that role of being in charge of the menstrual cycle. So they see a side of life, they deal with a side of life that men can not see, and men can choose also to not feel any responsibility for or in. Not all do, and not all would want to, but it just happens that they might not, because they don't have to deal with blood every month. So they don't have that priming and that sensitivity and that tolerance, and then that respect for that domain. And I think that too becomes a contributing factor. Can't believe we've ended up here. From leadership to pulling hair out the drain and dealing with menstrual blood. Yeah, but it's very much to the point of the feminine, right?
Well, yes, it is. And I think there's an awful lot of leaders out there, and I was noticing my own sort of reactions physically, my reactions as you were talking. Yes. Because and then I was sort of asking myself, where is that coming from? It's almost archetypal.
Yes.
This sense of wanting to distance from some of the things that you're saying. It's fascinating for me how often in these podcasts we're talking about how can we lead responsibly in a VUCA world with integrity and purpose. And actually, the word fear just keeps coming up. The fear of the unknown. And, you talk about VUCA, the ambiguity in that, the A.
Yes, this is the feminine, the unknown. In Tantra, we speak about the male being very powerful in the space of the known, and the woman gestating there for 9 months waiting is in practice with this part of the field, is the part that is unknown. It's the moon at night, the feminine. The sun is the masculine. So
Yeah.
the sun is radiant, visible for all to see. The moon is lurking, mysterious, waiting. It's beautiful. It's poetic.
And so the
I got excited and interrupted you. I'm sorry.
no, because I mean, this is so beautiful. One of the things I firmly believe in is that leaders of the future have got to be more self-aware. They've got to understand these movements that take place inside themselves that drive them in certain ways, and they're nonsensical, and yet they are so elemental. They're so deeply rooted, and so, you know, I found it fascinating whenever I've raised sort of menstrual cycles in polite circles. There's this sort of what I've learned is a deep respect for something that I was never brought up to understand or to see or to know, and yet you've sort of described some aspects of that. It is so fundamental, and yet both men and women push it away. They try and hold it back. I remember one woman speaking to me when we were in this kind of conversation, and she said, you know, you work with your PA. Do you know her menstrual cycle? I said, no. She said, well, if she's prepared to share that, it would help you. And, you know, if you are inviting her to take time off when she needs to go inside and be, dare I say, fully the woman that she is, then you'll get more out of her. You'll, you know, and I'd never thought of that.
So impressed, Tom. I'm so impressed. This is exactly the kind of work we are unearthing in Women of Truth, and actually beyond it, because it is quite known to a lot of women now that there is great power in syncing this feminine rhythm of life with the success rate and the expectations of success. And many women coming out in the book, even we have an example of Sarah Yaga, who's actually a menstrual coach, and other women. You know, there's very big impacts if women have been sexually violated to their relationship with their own femininity, which really affects relationships, which should then become a very important conversation, because that time going within is all about healing. And if there isn't respect for it, and there isn't, you know, understanding of that, this woman goes in defiance to her own need continuously. And the world has trained women to do that. We have actually been, I think, pretty consciously manipulated out of that mojo, that magic of being in sync. You know, women used to menstruate with the 27 moon day cycle, and there's 27 days to sync up the biorhythm in the body. And because we now work on a Judeo-Christian calendar, we don't have that natural sync up. So women fight harder to try to find it, and many of them have no clue. So that puts them out of sync with their own bodies. We see so much more infertility now. We see so many products of that amnesia that have been forced into. And then you say so rightly, men are oblivious to this. And it's really how women would not fall pregnant. They would follow that calendar, 13 days, safe periods. It's how they would go into ceremony. It's how they would come to terms with the true nature of living and the true nature of death, is that very important substance is in relationship with them continuously. So it's also what activates these deeper pathways for them to learn to love, to nurture, to not want to shed blood elsewhere. So you see a lot of connection to the way of living is lost when we're not aware of this, and when we're not speaking the truth about it. So, you know, let this podcast be a call to all of us that even when we speak professionally, we can go to the depths and to the most unexpected places to speak the deepest truth, because these are very, very important things for us to start to learn to be more comfortable with. They are part of our own nature. And there's a very interesting anecdotal piece in psychoanalytic work which talks about how men have an innate fear towards the feminine because they have left the feminine from their mothers, and they have such an attraction back to the feminine if they are heterosexual, or to some feminine qualities even if they are homosexual or non-defined or binary or fluid or whatever we call that. There is a fascinating conversation about what are we doing with gender and how do we work with male, female in the world now when it comes to young people trying to process that fluidity. Is learning how to have less constrictive views about gender and learning how to be able to move and flow inside, you know, what is feminine and what is masculine. So we have this very beautiful challenge really to come into union and complementary union with these two different forces, which means we are going to have some uncomfortable moments learning how to be certain things, express certain things, understand certain things that we've just decided we don't have to because we're a girl or we're a boy, or because we're a woman or we're a man, or we're hetero, you know, we're different race groups or different religions. So this integrative psychology is such an important piece. But back to that psychoanalytic thing. So then for men, it's quite threatening when you ask me the reason to have to look deeply at the reality of how birth happens, because there's a conflict, it's said in psychoanalytic work, between the attraction back to the feminine, if there is a heterosexual person we're speaking about, and the desire to be free of it forever. So there's like this dance between I want to be independent and responsible for myself. I don't want this faffing mother nurturing all over me. And, you know, yes, it's lovely that I'm attracted to this woman if I'm heterosexual and I want to be with her, but I don't want to go back there. In the physical sense, there's very interesting references to that. And then also energetically, I don't want to go back there. I don't want to be infantilized again. And so we have this very interesting relationship sometimes, men and women, in developing in relationships, is how to not play out that role. That's the whole Freudian Oedipal complex that soon the world is saying goodbye to, because I don't think many people in the world really understand it at the primordial archetypal level that it refers to. But it's this subtle level of intolerance and distaste and shame for being associated back to the feminine in a way where I have to actually step up and take more responsibility. In so many different ways now as well when it's on an adult level. Yeah.
And I suppose that kind of explains some of the expressions of misogyny that we see so much of.
And very, very nice for us to bring it back. Exactly what you just said comes back to what I was saying before. That's what we see in human nature, is that when we are trying to resist something, we will go sometimes and counteract it or even compensate for it. And a lot of the bullying tactics and a lot of the kind of over-controlling nature that we might see from male to female, you know, that kind of pull away is sometimes very much because there is a deeper desire to want to come to terms and integrate with it, but not yet the skill to do so. So I'll kind of demonize it or pathologize it or shame it. And we've got a lot of that throughout all the gender discussion, you know, how we shame women for so many different things. You know, that comes after working with many different survivors or victims of gender-based violence. You see how gender and violence and power have a very sordid story to tell us about our own human nature and our intolerance with seeing these parts of us that are really unhealthy or very toxic or greedy or impurities of the mind playing out in ways where we just simply haven't done the work, we haven't been shown the way, we haven't got enough education, we don't have people holding our hands and saying, you know, at a young age when we boys or girls, like, you know, this is something you really need to be respectful of, you know, like it's not bad and it's not, you know, something to be afraid of. This is how it works. And we try to do it, but I think we need, as we said right at the top of this podcast, very specific leaders that have been to those depths and have really seen themselves, and they've survived some time in that darkest night, and they've come through knowing their vulnerability at a very deep level, and they have great reverence and respect for the path that we all take, and they can guide us in that because they will show some of the way of how to do more of this respectfully.
So you know that we at Serenity and Leadership research and explore expressions of the masculine and the feminine, looking for ways for the feminine to be more widely expressed, both in men and women.
Yes.
From your experience, how can we encourage men to join in the conversation, and how can women help with this?
It's been a big topic of conversation amongst the female leaders that I work with, and the networks and the conferences and summits we all kind of contribute to, is how do we get men into these spaces, and are they always suitable spaces for men? In which contexts are they? And I think it's a consensus opinion now that we cannot go the rest of the way without men beside us, with us, behind us, wherever, right? We need to work together. There is a complementary nature between men and women, and we haven't reached that synergy yet. And it's part of all of our, I guess, contribution to the planet to be able to live into that space and contribute equally and complement each other truthfully. We do it in certain places, but we need to learn to do it in more. And I think one of the conversations I've seen is for more and more men to begin to understand through their partners what their partners' experiences are, if they have partners that are female, if they're heterosexual, and to take it upon themselves to become more educated about what women are about, separately to having them engage in these kind of contexts. I think that in itself is kind of exposure. You know, when you have prejudices towards things, the best thing is to actually spend time with that thing you have prejudice towards. This is all racial prejudice theories based on all that research of sitting with the thing I'm afraid of. So like when you're afraid of spiders, you need to sit with the spider, and slowly you kind of diffuse the fear. And you know, there's controversy around it, but it works. And we need it in this context. We need men to sit with women and understand them at a deeper level in the more normal area of life. Then when they feel more sensitized to this, and they themselves become a little bit more interested in the topic, like you have and many others are starting to do, I think it's great to come and engage in some of these women's networks. That's one suggestion I have for men, is to listen in and to be selective. Choose ones that you respect. Choose communities of women that you think are up to something that you align with in another area. You know, in your life, it doesn't have to be that, you know, you just want to, you know, get to know the feminine point of view, but what are the topics? You know, is it about environment? Is it women being more politically active? Is it youth? What is it? And see if you can engage in some of those platforms. And there are many of them now. This is why I'm suggesting it. There wasn't this opportunity like this before, whereas now there is. And see, how is it resonating? What part of you gets ignited? What is happening in the personal space when you're listening to what these women are about on that leadership level? And then I think the conversation can happen also from father to son. I think there's a very important gap in our societies, because women are not passing on the eldership like they used to before, and neither are men. We're trying to do it in a new modernized version, but it's not happening. It's very clear to see when I work with young people and with, you know, parents therapeutically, it's very challenging to actually get a realistic, wise point of view from an ancestral kind of lineage and or an elder in the community, and many elders in the community, like it used to happen in ancient practices. So now we have to compensate for that. And so there are projects like the Mankind Project goes off and brings men into kind of collectives and sort of initiates them through nature in some kind of way to talk more about some of these topics we've been talking about today and many others. We have an equivalent to this of like men teaching their sons to go fishing, or, you know, maybe even more extreme, and in some cases people agree, others don't, of men teaching boys to hunt. But these things are not necessarily synced up with the times we're living in. So we need to evolve some of these forward. And I would love to see men coming forward doing that and thinking of new ways to support young men to understand more about women. And then, quite frankly, I think the time is here already for men and women to get on equal platforms, the ones that are ready, because there are many that aren't, and there are many that will never be, honestly. That's something I've taken my career to accept, and I have eventually. Some of us are not here for the big game. Some of us are going to stay on levels of self-interest, and that's just where we are. And it doesn't have to be judged. It needs to be accepted at some level, but to really just support people to get to a very next level that they can get to, you know, that's fair enough, because you might go on a renegade hunt to try and convert and transform the world where, you know, the world doesn't need to be transformed and converted. Some say we are in divine time and divine order. So each to his own, which take anybody wants to have on that. But I think the people that are ready and are willing can jump onto platforms and begin talking about how do we get more women into political debate? How do we get more leaders voted in that have a level of awareness and consciousness to deal with things? It's often not the answers to these questions that are stopping us. It's more the systemic toxicity that we've created that we have to unravel. But we need a few transformational people in these sectors to start to diffuse that toxicity. But it's not easy work. So I've always been scouting for people that are able to do more of the support behind the scenes for those who are going to go and be more upfront or in the visibility spaces that leadership requires nowadays. There will need to be a council, an advisory board, a support structure that's therapeutically trained, that's dealing with crisis, that knows how to deal with conflict mediation, but not just at the diplomatic professional level, at the emotional level. So until and if anyone's interested in setting those kinds of structures up, you know, we might have very short-lived type conversations, but I think there is some momentum growing, so even people listen
slowly. So Helen, we should draw this to a close. If people want to learn more about your work and what you're doing, and perhaps to converse with you, how do they get hold of you?
I'm offering some discovery calls for people if they want to go to this next level in their leadership capacity. And they can find me on a website, simply www.helenaha.com. So it's helenaha.com. And I'm on LinkedIn as Helenique, my nickname, Heleniq. And you heard that surname, Argyrou, Argyrou. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much, Thom, for this, and for everyone listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been great to hear your wisdom and your experience.
Yeah, wonderful indeed. Thank you so much.
Bye.